Hey, welcome to Faith Seeking Understanding Online. You're listening to the last lesson in our module that we've been working through called Through His People, where we've been looking at key figures through the Bible story that God has been working through to achieve His plans and purposes, and how all of those find their fulfillment and their culmination in the person and work of Jesus Christ. If you've been listening to the other lessons in this module, then you know the drill by now. If you want to ask a question and are listening in the week that this video comes out, then just hit that Ask a Question button on the lesson page on our website. If you're not on our website, then you can find the link in the description below. But please get your questions in by Friday so that we can have the questions video ready for next week, Monday. If you're listening to this in the weeks after this has come out, then, well, why don't you go check out that question video to see what people wanted to know more about and where we got to dig a little bit deeper into this idea of the servant, which is what we're going to be looking at in the lesson today. Before we get there, though, it'll be helpful for us to do a bit of a recap of the Bible story up until that point, recapping some of the things that we've said over the course of this module and just getting a big picture of the Old Testament story before we get to meet the servant figure. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The creation account begins with tohu wavohu, wild and waste, desert and wasteland, chaotic, uninhabitable, all the rest of it, which you can find in lesson 1, which over the course of the chapter, God brings to a state of order. It's a movement from anti-fruitfulness to conducive to fruitfulness. He placed the humans there in the land teeming with life and abundance to work it and to keep it, which we've said alludes to the Levitical system, to the Levitical duties in the temple, which implies that the humans that God has placed here play a sort of priestly role in God's creation. But we've also said that that's only half the story. Adam isn't only portrayed as a priest, but as a priest king. And that fits well with the mandate that we saw the humans receive in Genesis 1. God's created humanity in his image. He created them in the image of God. He created them male and female. And what does that mean? Well, chiefly it means exercising dominion and acting as God's stewards over creation, not merely partaking in the fruitfulness of the creation, but in some sense imitating God in bringing it about. The commission God gave them, we've seen, was very important. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it." This commission was passed on to Noah and then to Abraham, and God made a promise and a covenant with Abraham. "I'll make you into a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great. Be a blessing, and I will bless those who bless you and curse those who dishonor you. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." God promised to make Abraham into a great nation, and that he and in turn his descendants would be a conduit of God's blessing to the rest of the nations. Exodus opens with Abraham's family, now too numerous to count, being enslaved. But God remembers his covenant with Abraham, and on that basis, he rescues his people from Egypt. In an act of new creation, a sort of decreation of Egypt with the plagues and new creation of the Israelites being brought through the chaotic waters of the Red Sea, which echoes back to the flood story and further back to the tohu wavohu in Genesis 1 verse 2. God rescued his people out of Egypt and brought them to Mount Sinai, where he formally made his covenant with them. So we read in Exodus 19, "You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." In lesson 3, we thought together about the priests as mediators of God's covenant presence among his people. Here in Exodus 19, though, what seems to be implied is that the entire nation of Israel are to mediate God's covenant presence to all the rest of the nations. It's now the nation of Israel who is to act as God's representatives through whom he'll extend his blessing to the rest of the nations. As one writer puts it, the purpose of this covenant made at Sinai is that an obedient Israel may bring God's creation blessing to the world. Unfortunately, obedient isn't really the word for Israel. While Moses is up the mountain receiving the law, Israel are at the bottom of the mountain breaking it. They're making a golden calf, and then when they set off again in the book of Numbers, they continually moan against Moses and God. "Oh, for some meat," they exclaimed. "We remember the fish we used to eat for free in Egypt, and we had all the cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic we wanted, but now our appetites are gone. All we ever see is this manna." The grass was greener on the other side, but not the side that God was taking them to, but the side back in Egypt. They see in Numbers 13 the land that God is taking them to. But in the very next chapter, we read that the whole community began weeping aloud, and they cried all night. Their voices rose in a great chorus of protest against Moses and Aaron. "If only we had died in Egypt, or even here in the wilderness," they complained. "Why is the Lord taking us to this country only to have us die in battle? Our wives and our little ones will be carried off as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to return to Egypt?" Then they plotted among themselves, "Let us choose a new leader and go back to Egypt." To them, it was better to be in Egypt, to serve the Egyptian gods, than to serve Yahweh. And so God says, fine, whatever. None of you will go in. I'll give it to your kids rather. So a generation later, they're on the border of the promised land, and Moses implores them, "Guys, please do this right. Listen, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. And you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your strength. And you must commit yourselves wholeheartedly to these commands that I'm giving you today. Repeat them again and again to your children. Talk about them when you're at home and when you're on the road and when you're going to bed and when you're getting up. Tie them to your hands and wear them on your foreheads as reminders. Write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Do whatever it takes. Stay faithful to Yahweh as you go into the good land that he has promised to give you." And under Joshua, the one who took over from Moses when he died, things get off to a really good start. But in the book of Judges, the wheels come off, and the book ends with a civil war. The judges come to an end, and the kingship is established in Samuel, which is what we looked at in our previous lesson on the king. But we saw that while the kingdom reached a high point in under the rule of David, the man after God's own heart, it didn't take long for the wheels to come off and for them to end up being casted off into exile. Now, it's in exile that 2nd Isaiah was written. 2nd Isaiah is just a way of talking about the second major part of Isaiah, mainly chapters 40 to 55, as opposed to 1st Isaiah, which is chapters 1 to 39. And in 2nd Isaiah, we're introduced to somebody else. 1st Isaiah introduces us to the Davidic king, the Messiah. 2nd Isaiah introduces us to the servant. So that's what we're going to be looking at for the next section of this talk. We're going to be looking at the servant in Isaiah, thinking together about what this servant figure is all about and who it is. It'll be helpful for us to get some background first. Under the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon stormed Jerusalem at the end of 2 Kings, destroyed the temple, and whatever was left and that he wanted in Jerusalem, he took it on back to Babylon. Following him were some weaker kings, and in the end, the throne was usurped by a guy named Nabonidus. Now, Nabonidus was a bit of a controversial fellow. Perhaps most controversial about him was that he established Sin, the moon god, as the new chief deity of the Babylonian pantheon, exalting him over Marduk, who ever since the establishment of the Babylonian monarchy had been regarded as the undisputed king of the gods. And, as you can imagine, this seriously ticked off the priests of Marduk. In the meantime, Persia was making a comeback. Cyrus, himself a usurper, led some rebellions, reclaiming Ecbatana, his capital city, and he began to gain power. Babylon alone now stood between Cyrus and complete control over the entire region. And in 540 BC, that is where he turned his gaze. Except that when he got there, he didn't have to fight for it. The priests of Marduk just gave it to him. They opened the city gates and just let him have it. Now, there are at least two things that I think we should know about Cyrus's reign for our purposes. The first is his strategy. We said in the previous lesson that it was one thing to conquer another country. It was quite another to keep control once he'd done so. Assyria kept control by brute force and fear tactics. Babylon kept control by plundering the place. They would take the elite of society along with any treasure and resources and bring it all over to Babylon. Whatever was left then wouldn't be much of a threat. Cyrus's strategy was different again. He saw himself as the great liberator. He kept control essentially by trying to make friends with everybody. And that's more or less what we see in 2nd Isaiah. But that also explains the second thing that we should know about Cyrus. In taking Babylon, he re-established the worship of Marduk, which he also used to his own advantage. Archaeologists have actually found what we now know as the Cyrus cylinder, from when Cyrus took over Babylon from Nabonidus. In it we read, "When I entered Babylon in a peaceful manner, I took up my lordly reign in the royal palace amidst rejoicing and happiness. Marduk, the great lord, caused the magnanimous people of Babylon to me, and I daily attended to his worship. My vast army moved about Babylon in peace. I did not permit anyone to frighten the people of Sumer and Akkad. I sought the welfare of the city of Babylon and all its sacred centers. As for the citizens of Babylon, upon whom he imposed corvée, which was not the God's will and was not befitting them, I relieved their weariness and freed them from their service. Marduk, the great lord, rejoiced over my good deeds. He sent gracious blessings upon me, Cyrus, the king who worships him, and upon Cambyses, the son who is my offspring, and upon all my army, and in peace before him we move about." That's the situation that 2nd Isaiah is written into. That's the situation that it's speaking to. Israel, you remember, were in exile in Babylon, so they were right there in the thick of all this while all this was playing itself out. And 2nd Isaiah is basically about God restoring and redeeming his people. "Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and proclaim to her that her hard service has been completed, that her sin has been paid for, that she has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins." But we learn that the way that God is going to bring this about is, at least in part, through Cyrus, who has stirred up one from the east, calling him in righteousness to his service. He hands nations over to him and subdues kings before him. He turns them to dust with his sword and to wind-blown chaff with his bow. He pursues them and moves on unscathed, by a path his feet have not traveled before. Who has done this and carried it through, calling forth the generations from the beginning? I, the Lord, with the first of them, and with the last, I am he. And a few chapters later, this is what the Lord says, your Redeemer, who formed you in the womb. I am the Lord, the maker of all things, who stretched out the heavens, who spreads the earth by himself, who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and will accomplish all that I please. He will say of Jerusalem, let it be rebuilt, and of the temple, let its foundations be laid. All the way through, Isaiah wants to make clear that it's Yahweh bringing this about, not Marduk. Marduk was born, Yahweh always was. It wasn't Marduk who created the heavenly host, it was Yahweh. Marduk had a personal advisor. Yahweh was wise enough that he didn't need one. Marduk isn't in control. Yahweh is. Marduk isn't king over all. Yahweh is. Yahweh is the one bringing all this about, working to redeem and to restore his people. And what we learn is that he's going to do this through his servant. But while Cyrus has an important role to play, Cyrus is not that servant. Rather, he has a mission to God's servant, which is what we see in Isaiah 45 verse 4. The question, though, is that if Cyrus isn't the servant, who is? Now, perhaps you think of the words of Isaiah 53 and think that the answer is obvious. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgression. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. And a little further down, after he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. It's one of those passages that we whip out around Easter. Surely the servant is Jesus. Or at the very least, the servant in 2nd Isaiah is the Messiah in 1st Isaiah. And to be sure, when we compare the language used to describe the servant with that used to describe the Messiah back in 1st Isaiah, we do see some parallels. The servant is, according to Oswald, an individual, almost certainly the Messiah, who will be the ideal Israel. The problem with this is that it doesn't fit so nicely with other passages in 2nd Isaiah. You, Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen, the descendants of Abraham, my friend. I took you from the ends of the earth, from its farthest corners I called you. I said, you are my servant. I have chosen you and not rejected you. Here the servant isn't an individual. The servant is the nation of Israel, who we should probably assume is still being spoken about in the next chapter. Here is my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen one in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and I will bring justice to the nations. He will not shout or cry out, or raise his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smouldering wick he will not snuff out. In faithfulness he will bring forth justice. He will not falter or be discouraged till he establishes justice on earth. In his teaching the islands will put their hope. Brevet Childs puts it quite forcefully: for anybody who takes the larger literary context seriously, there can be no avoiding the obvious implication that in some way Israel is the servant who is named in 42 verse 1. No one else is named. Perhaps it still could be the Messiah in view. We saw something like that in last week's lesson. Could it be that it's talking about an individual that represents the nation, the Messiah who is representing the whole of Israel? Perhaps, but I think if so, we'll have trouble with other parts of Isaiah 42. Hear you deaf, look you blind and see. Who is blind but my servant, and deaf like the messenger I send? Who is blind like the one in covenant with me? Blind like the servant of the Lord. You have seen many things, but you pay no attention. Your ears are open, but you do not listen. I don't know about you, but I'm not inclined to think about Jesus that way. While the servant and the Messiah do seem to share some of the same characteristics, these on their own aren't enough to say that they are in fact the same figure. As one scholar puts it, both the servant and the Davidic ruler are empowered by God's Spirit and share a common royal task of bringing forth justice because they are both agents of the same king, namely Yahweh. The point, rather, is that high hopes were placed in what Israel was supposed to be. Isaiah 42:6. I am the Lord, I have called you in righteousness. I will take you by the hand and keep you. I will give you as a covenant for the people, a light for the nations, to open the eyes that are blind, to bring out the prisoners from the dungeon, from the prison those who sit in darkness. The people of Israel were meant to be a conduit of God's blessing to the nations. Think Genesis 12. Think through Abraham's family, the whole world was going to enjoy God's blessing. Or think Exodus 19. The Israelites were to be a kingdom of priests. And although Isaiah is using different language here, the same idea is conveyed. One scholar says, the one commissioned does not form a covenant, but rather embodies a covenantal relationship with the nations. It was through Israel that the nations would come to know God and enter into covenant relationship with him. The problem is that Israel didn't do that. Ironically, while God's servant is to open eyes of the blind, the reality is that Israel is in no condition to fulfill this task. Though they should set free those in prison, they are in prison as they remain unresponsive to God even after experiencing his judgment, presumably in exile. In chapters 40 to 48, the servant is Israel. But in chapter 49, there is a shift. In chapter 49, we meet somebody else, also the servant of the Lord, but we get the sense that something is different. Now the Lord says, "He who formed me in the womb to be his servant, to bring Jacob back to him and gather Israel to himself. For I am honored in the eyes of the Lord, and my God has been my strength." He says, "It is too small a thing for you to be my servant, to restore the tribes of Jacob and to bring back those of Israel I have kept. I will also make you a light for the nations, that my salvation may reach the ends of the earth." Notice how, in some sense, the commission is the same. I will also make you a light to the nations. In verse 3, the servant again is identified with Israel in some way. But whereas earlier the nation of Israel was consistently in view, here the servant is given a mission to Israel, which implies that they actually aren't the same person. Oswald, I think, explains this part really well. The servant is going to function as Israel. He will be for Israel and the world what Israel could not be. Faced with Israel's failure, God does not wipe out the nation. He simply devises another way in which Israel's servanthood could be worked out through the ideal Israel. Again, this is seen in light of redemption and restoration. It calls to mind Exodus. Isaiah 52, "The Lord will lay bare his holy arm in the sight of all nations, and all the ends of the earth will see the salvation of our God." In Exodus 15, "The Lord is my strength and my song. He has become my salvation." And a little further down, "The nations will fear and tremble. Anguish will grip the people of Philistia. By the power of your arm, they will be still as stone until your people pass by, Lord, until the people you bought pass by." The Lord will bear his arm. How? Through his servant. Who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? And look who's introduced in the very next verse in answer to that question. "He grew up like a tender shoot, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering, familiar with pain, like one from whom people hide their faces. He was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Surely he took our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him. By his wounds we are healed. We all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way. But the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before his shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. Yet who of his generation protested? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgression of my people he was punished. He was assigned a grave with the wicked, and with the rich in his death. Though he had done no violence, nor was there any deceit in his mouth, yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And the Lord makes his life a guilt offering. He will see his offspring and prolong his days, and the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. Now, don't lose sight of the context. 2nd Isaiah is about God restoring his people. But in Isaiah 53, we learn that the way he's going to do that is through the suffering of the servant. This servant will be a guilt offering, calling to mind the Levitical system. We read in Leviticus 5 that somebody must bring his guilt offering for the sin he has committed to the Lord, a female lamb or a goat from the flock as a sin offering. And in this way, the priest will make atonement on his behalf for his sin. A guilt offering could take a variety of forms, and it didn't always have to involve a sacrifice. This example from Leviticus 5 is just one example, but it gives a flavor for what the guilt offering was all about. As one scholar explains, at the core of the asham, which is the guilt offering, was the idea that guilt had been incurred, so reparations needed to be made, either towards the injured party or, most often, towards God. Removing guilt through blood would bring about forgiveness and atonement, resulting in a restored standing with God amid the holy community. That's what seems to be going on with the servant. In a really unexpected turn of events, maybe not unexpected to us because we're used to reading this passage around Easter and thinking Jesus, but try getting in the mind of the original audience. This would have been really unexpected, that the servant is a sacrifice made for God's people to be restored. The suffering of the servant takes away the guilt of the many exiles and many nations so that there can be peace between them and God. So what we have in 2nd Isaiah is a picture of Israel as God's servant who were meant to be a light to the nations and a covenant to the people. The problem was that Israel were just as blind as the nations were. Even so, God says that he is going to restore them, and he's going to establish his kingdom once more. He's going to do that through his servant, this time an individual, who will be all that Israel was supposed to be in Israel's place. The question that was left hanging in the air, though, is who is this servant? Now, we've spent some time thinking about who the servant is in Isaiah, and having done so, we're in a better position to think about how Jesus actually answers that, how Jesus can actually be the servant, and how we can fully appreciate that claim. So let's think together about the servant in the Gospels. The scene is set in Mark's Gospel by 2nd Isaiah. It's the beginning of the good news about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God, as it's written in Isaiah the prophet, a voice of one calling in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight paths for him. Here, we noticed in our previous lesson, Mark is calling to mind Isaiah 40, which now that we've spent a whole lot of time in 2nd Isaiah, we have a clearer picture of. It's written to God's people who are waiting on God to establish his kingdom, to bring restoration and renewal to his people, which he's announcing that he is about to do. And how does Isaiah say that that is going to happen? Well, through God's servant, who we're introduced to a few verses later, now back in Mark's Gospel. At that time, Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. Just as Jesus was coming up out of the water, he saw heaven being torn open and the Spirit descending on him like a dove. And a voice came from heaven, "You are my Son, whom I love. With you I am well pleased." We noticed how this could be calling to mind Psalm 2 and 2 Samuel 7. This isn't so much Jesus' baptism as it is Jesus' anointing. What we didn't think about, though, is how this is also calling to mind Isaiah 42. "Here is my servant whom I uphold, my chosen one in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will bring justice to the nations." Except that the way that Jesus is going to do that is completely different to how anyone expected him to. Jesus and his disciples went to the villages around Caesarea Philippi, and on the way, he asked them, "Who do people say I am?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." "What about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Peter answered, "You're the Messiah." Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests and the teachers of the law, and he must be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Peter was expecting something more Son of Man, something more messianic, victorious, kick butt, establish God's kingdom. Instead, quite unexpectedly, Jesus is going the way of the suffering servant in Isaiah 53. The same idea comes up again later. Even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Again, it's the Son of Man in view. Again, I think the disciples would have expected power and greatness and God establishing his kingdom in glory. But instead, again, they get the suffering servant of Isaiah 53, who gives his life for the many. In summary, God is establishing his kingdom, and he's doing so through his servants. But the way that works itself out is completely different to what people were expecting. The way that God is establishing his kingdom is by his servants suffering and dying. We also find the story of the servant quietly in the background of Paul's letter to the Romans, in the first part of Romans. In lesson 1, we spent a bit of time thinking about Romans 1, how Paul talks about the problem of sin as a sort of reversal of the way that God has ordered creation. Instead of worshipping the Creator, they are worshipping the creation, and it's essentially an idolatry problem. But then, and in chapter 1, he's predominantly got the Gentiles in mind. But then in chapter 2, Paul turns his focus to the Jews to say, actually, you're no better off. Actually, God shows no favoritism. Now, if you call yourself a Jew, if you rely on the law and boast in God, if you know his will and approve of what is superior because you are instructed by the law, if you are convinced that you are a guide for the blind, a light for those who are in the dark, an instructor for the foolish, a teacher of little children, because you have in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth, you then who teach others, do not teach yourself. Think again of the servants in the first part of 2nd Isaiah, supposed to be a light for the nations, but they were blind themselves. Paul, in fact, goes a step further to say, effectively, it's one thing to have the covenant, but if you don't keep the covenant, you're not really part of God's people. A person is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is circumcision merely outward and physical. No, a person is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is circumcision of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the written code. Such a person's praise is not from other people, but from God. But if that's the case, what does that say about God? God made a promise to Abraham that through him, the whole world would be blessed. They were meant to be a conduit of God's blessing. It was through them that the nations were to come to know God. That's where Paul turns next. What if some were unfaithful? Will their unfaithfulness nullify God's faithfulness? Not at all. Let God be true and every human being a liar. As N.T. Wright puts it, God has not given up on his plan to bring light to the world through Israel. The question, given Israel's unfaithfulness, is how? And that's what Paul is building up to in the last third of Romans 3. But now, apart from the law, God's righteousness has been made known, though it has been testified to by the law and the prophets, namely, a righteousness through the faithfulness of Christ for all who believe. For there is no distinction, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, being declared righteous freely by his grace through redemption in Christ Jesus, whom God set forth as an atoning sacrifice through his faithfulness, by his blood as proof of his righteousness, through the passing over of sins done before, in his forbearance, to be a demonstration of his righteousness in the present time, so as to be righteous and the one who declares them righteous because of the faithfulness of Christ. In Jesus, God's righteousness has been put on display, God's saving righteousness, where he's redeeming and restoring his people and establishing his kingdom. He's doing that through his faithful servant, all the way that Paul puts it in Romans 5:19, through the obedience of the one man, the many will be made righteous. Though Israel was faithless, God will remain faithful to his covenant to deal with Adam's sin and bless the world through them. And in 3:22, we find out how. Jesus, as Messiah, has drawn together the identity and vocation of Israel upon himself. And notice how the servant does it. God set Jesus forth as an atoning sacrifice through his faithfulness by his blood, which surely calls to mind the way that the servant in Isaiah 53 died and made atonement for the people. But don't lose sight of the movement here. Jesus does do away with sin here. But he does so as a new Israel, in continuity with the promises made to Abraham, that Israel would be a conduit of God's blessing to the nations and a covenant to the people. The main thing Paul wants to say in this paragraph is that God has done in and through Jesus what he promised and purposed all along. Or, put differently, in Christ, God is doing what he's always been doing in a much fuller way. That's it for the first module of Faith Seeking Understanding Season 2. Thank you for joining us. We really hope it's been helpful. If you've got a question, please remember to try get it in by Friday so that we can have the questions video up by Monday, 6 o'clock, which you can look out for, where you'll hear our responses to your questions and also what's coming next for Faith Seeking Understanding. Thanks for joining us. See you next time.